Hello and welcome to this DW Business Special, where we're discussing the true impact of international sanctions on Russia. The international backlash against Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine has been like none ever seen before. But in the months since the invasion, Western nations have themselves been experiencing the negative knock-on effects, with inflation rife and economies slowing. Meanwhile, Russia has continued to post economic figures that don't suggest the meltdown that had once been predicted. Well, to discuss whether or not that really is the state of things, I'm joined by Jeffrey Sonnenfeld from Yale School of Management. We actually spoke to Jeffrey on the TV a few days ago, and our YouTube viewers were so keen to hear more from him that we brought him back. Jeffrey, thank you very much for being with us once again.
Oh, well, thank you, Rob. It's great to be back with DW from a few days ago, but also to be with you personally after we spoke a few months ago about the historic surge of exits from Russia, from the business community.
Yeah, and we'll talk about how that has expanded in the months since. Jeffrey Sonnenfeld and his team at Yale School of Management have established what they say is a true picture of the Russian economy. They say that the Kremlin is more vulnerable than is often being reported. For example, through its energy sector, which provides 60% of total government funding via exports. And Russia is also facing an import crisis. They've fallen as much as 50% since the start of the war. And then there's also the exit of foreign firms. The Yale team says over 1,000 companies have curtailed their operations in Russia. This idea that Russia somehow has the West over a barrel right now, is that missing the point?
Yes, it's certainly not over a barrel of oil and not over a pipeline of gas. It is missing the point. And you summarized our work so well. We almost should trade places, and I should ask you the questions. You absolutely have mastered the research. What is astounding here is that initially many journalists were accepting President Putin's highly misleading propaganda, and a false narrative temporarily went out there. We're trying to dispel that by actually taking a look at what the numbers say. It's important to realize, first off, that for the last 70, 80 years, national income statistics that every country produces were even coming out of Russia for the last 20 or 30, since Yeltsin and even through the Putin years, up until the last few months. And Putin has suppressed, he has deleted the standard macroeconomic national income statistics, the inputs and outputs of energy, of imports and exports, the central bank's standing, the performance of major Russian firms, which has all been required to be reported on a monthly basis, transportation data like the airline flows, the passenger traffic, and of that nature, loan origination. It's all that stuff. It's astounding that has been deleted. And instead, he's put up false metrics that people went for, such as, well, the ruble is doing well. The ruble is not an actively traded currency. It's not a traded currency whatsoever. In fact, you can't sell a ruble in Russia for dollars or anything. It's not a true number. And similarly, their stock market, which has only fallen by 50%, only by 50%, it can't fall more, because they don't allow foreigners to sell their holdings. So the Russians have sold out, and those from outside the country are stuck with this uninvestable assets, just like the default on their loans. So yeah, the country's in bad shape, and imports are down. And for industrial products, they can't replace what they need for machinery. They can't get the semiconductors that are needed for their technology. You can't get it for your personal iPhones, replacement parts of that nature, and luxury goods and everyday consumer goods. So that's a problem. And and when we talked last time, you and I, that is, we were looking at the amazing historic exit of private firms on top of the government sanctions. These two married together have a crushing blow, the government sanctions and then the individual company retreats and exits, that even Russia's data says it's 12% of their direct employment are from those companies. We think it's quite a bit larger than that, but just taking their number, the indirect employment off that is easily 3 times that. So we're looking at 40% of unemployment. Inflation is up anywhere from 20 to 60%, depending what sector you look at. And no, gas is not fungible like some journalists mistakenly thought because Putin said so. They thought it was so. Russian gas is, for the most part, not liquefied. It's got to travel through pipelines. And guess what? We don't have pipelines going into Asia. He can't just pivot to Russia sales into China or India. There's one little creaky pipeline. It's not even 10%. So he can't sell it there. Gazprom's production is down.
Well, these are all areas that I do want to go into, actually, in the next few minutes. You know, the impact on exports, imports, this idea of the pivot, and also, you know, the exodus. But what I want to talk a little bit more with you just briefly about is you were talking about analysts, journalists relying on data that has been selected by the Russian state and put out there to give, I suppose, a misleading picture. So you say you've got a more accurate picture. Where do you get your data from?
Well, what most macroeconomists would do that aren't lazy on summer vacation, and journalists, if they have the background, is they perform what's called triangulation, which is simply that. You get multiple data readings. You don't necessarily accept the government statistics as factually accurate. There are all kinds of other readings on unemployment levels that have to do with staffing services. There's data that's available on all kinds of international associations, say the Airplane Leasing Association has collaborative data that all the companies share there. So we take a look at what the traffic is that way. For every marketplace exchange in a global market, there's a buyer and a seller. If they're not telling us as the seller to oil, we know how much oil, how much energy, how much gas Europe is buying. It was 43%, but we know from Europe's EU's numbers that they're now buying more gas from the US and Norway than they are from Russia.
Right. So because trade is a two-way street, if you can't get, you know, the data from one direction, you can get it from the other. I'd just like to delve down a little bit deeper into the impact. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was anticipating your question. Another example of that having to do with, say, in the consumer goods area, is hardly any Russians, of course, buy Russian-made automobiles for obvious reasons of style, safety, and comfort and the rest. So they're largely foreign cars, non-Russian cars. Well, we know from all the non-Russian automakers, their sales into Russia are down 95%. So that's just another example of how the data is out there. Russia can't constrain it if you do your homework.
Right. Well, I just want to discuss the impact that sanctions are having on Russia's ability to export to the rest of the world. President Putin spoke to representatives of Russia's metal industries earlier this week, and he blamed Western restrictions for driving up prices in the sector.
This is an attempt by Western countries to put a hold on Russian business as one of the leaders in the world of metals products, and of course redistribute the markets in their favour. I would like to emphasise again that Russia will always be a reliable and responsible supplier of metals products for foreign buyers and partners, regardless of any political troubles of today. For those who are committed to profitable, predictable business cooperation, we will also be reliable partners. But we will not work towards our detriment with those who show us a clearly unfriendly attitude.
Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, is President Putin right to say Russia can continue to be a reliable exporting partner to countries that cooperate?
Russia has become an outlier, a rogue in the world community. They're not respecting intellectual property. They've violated, obviously, sovereign respect and for independent nations. They've shown this imperialistic surge and the bloody slaughter of innocent civilians. People don't want to do business with Russia. Nobody will lend to them anymore. So he's running high deficits, government deficits, which a lot of countries aren't so worried about because somebody will usually buy your debt. Nobody can buy Putin's debt because they've defaulted on it. So no, he's in trouble. And even rare metals we're finding in Congo, there are various parts of Africa, and even some we're finding at these prices, even in the U.S., but certainly in Africa and alternative sourcing. So he can do all the pouting and bravado that he wants. It doesn't change the facts that he doesn't control the spigots on energy. He's not, you know, this notion of Vladimir Putin as this savvy, crafty global energy czar. That myth is running out of gas itself.
Is Russia still a reliable import partner for its trade partners around the world? Can it still, you know, physically take in the products that it wants to take in and fulfill its contracts like that?
Well, Russia, the imports into Russia have plunged 50%, as you mentioned in your opening. What's remarkable, even China's imports into Russia have plunged 50%. Of those 1,200 major multinationals that pulled out of there, for the most part, there were almost none that were more than 2%. There were a handful that were 10% of their earnings. And most of them were 10% of their revenues were about 1%. And in fact, that the magnitude of how much companies pulled out of there, whether or not it was a complete pullout or if it was a temporary suspension or a partial suspension, the magnitude of their exit directly corresponded with how richly they were rewarded by their owners financially. The financial markets rewarded the companies for pulling out of Russia because of the reputation risk, the operational risk, and the financial risk. As one very, very prominent financier said to us recently, we believe in investing where there is the rule of law and not the law of rulers.
You mentioned China, and much has been made of the idea that Russia will perform a dramatic pivot to Asia in order to replace lost trade with Europe, as well as increasing its economic ties with, the giant that is China. Moscow also has its sights set on India. It's formulating plans to replace its rather circuitous existing trade routes with the South Asian country with a much more direct corridor via Azerbaijan and Iran. It would halve the time it takes to transport goods between Russia and India.
It's still it's very hard.
I was just going to ask you. I mean, how valuable is the idea that Asia can cushion the blow of Western sanctions for Russia?
Well, we know that Asia can't absorb the gas. They can't get it there. They don't have the pipeline. It's not liquefied. By contrast, Europe, which is not suffering, as we sort of discussed in the opening, in the long term, in fact, in the intermediate term, right now, Germany quite successfully has 6 plants up and that will be up and running by the end of the calendar year. By the most conservative estimates, there will be conversion from liquid gas back to its gasified state, so that it can receive from many other parts of the world more energy in there. The pivot to Asia for oil that is also suggested is not so easy. There were some prominent analysts, J.P. Morgan and others, that were looking at close to $400 a barrel estimates based on what Putin was saying. We're nowhere near there. Today, it's fallen from 100 now to 90, and we're looking like we could be hitting $80 a barrel very soon. For Russia, though, trying to sell the oil that nobody else is now buying from them to China or India, India's reserves are largely filled. Their tanks they don't have much storage for much more oil. But even so, India and China are very effectively playing Russia by demanding a $35 discount. So if they're selling it in there at $52 a barrel, they're hardly making money, because even though Russia is the 3rd largest OPEC producer, they're also the most inefficient. To get that oil to Europe was taking them a day, 2 days, at very worst 5 or 6 days. To get it over to India or China, the oil now, that'll take them 35 days, and that's really a problem. So it's hard to see that they can do that pivot. And other goods that they badly need semiconductors and other things that China and India are not selling to them. So they're not getting that. In fact, China again has cut their imports into Russia, not increased them. Even their lending has been cut off.
Some of this pivot taking place, though, aren't we? I mean, there was some data published on Thursday that showed that Russia's just become India's 3rd biggest supplier of coal. Exports have leapt 10% in a month. So that pivot is happening, isn't it?
They're trying desperately, but it is a pittance. As basically, Russia is almost like becoming a vassal state to those types of trading partners, that they're merely commodities. If this was some old mercantile system, that they bring to the global marketplace nothing except commodities, energy, and grain. That's and cyber terrorism. There's not much else anybody wants to buy. So I think that it's hard for them to get substitution they need. So for Russia to trickle in some more coal, that's hardly going to make up. That's why they're running the deficits they're running. They're also drawing down on their reserve. They have $600 billion foreign currency reserve that's been a cushion for Putin to try to prop things up, that will be running out. He just, since the outbreak of war, has spent about $80 billion of that currency reserve. And half of that $600 billion currency reserve is frozen by the West. He doesn't have access to it. And we hope and expect that that will be reallocated to the Ukrainians to rebuild Ukraine through all this.
I want to talk about the corporate reaction to the war now that we've just covered, exports and imports, because there's been an avalanche of Western brands pulling out of Russia since it invaded Ukraine. The latest to leave the Russian high street is Swedish retailer H&M, which closed its stores this week. Here's how some of the local shoppers felt about that.
This will give our domestic producers more platforms to develop, and we need to raise the economy.
I think that Russian designers will make up for H&M very well. I didn't find anything special in the brand.
It's a pity. I'm sad.
Well, H&M is just the latest to complete its exodus. Yale School of Management has been keeping track of how Western firms' operations in Russia have changed or not since the Ukraine invasion. It calculates that over 300 have pulled out of the country altogether. 500 have suspended their business there. Others have reduced their operations or said they won't increase them. But Yale says that some 240 Western brands are operating there as normal. So let's go back to Jeffrey Sonnenfeld on this. I mean, we heard some ordinary Russians there brushing off the exit of H&M, but what impact is the corporate exodus actually having?
It's a profound impact. First, on the direct employment is substantial. The indirect employment is substantial. And many high-end professionals, skilled, talented workers are fleeing Russia, losing those jobs, that we not only have somewhere 35–40% unemployment coming along, but you see the data. Even TASS himself admitted by April, they admitted, as Russia's, of course, central official media voice, that they had lost 700,000 skilled professionals. TASS admitted that already by April. So, it's only gone up from there, and they need that. So it isn't that, somehow they're happily going to be reemployed in a lookalike Russian company. That Russian know-how is not there. That's why these Western companies were there. Now, some of the reasons those brands were there, because they represented a resentment, a reprisal of former Soviet-era quality and repression. So those Western brands did have a certain luxury cachet to them, and a statement of support for capitalism and the bridge of perhaps a global harmony that was intended that. But somehow that didn't last, and that didn't work. But those Western brands aren't there for just cosmetic reasons. That's why it was so much of this economy. If Russia could have been self-reliant, they would have been self-reliant. Maybe Vladimir Putin can take a lookalike McDonald's and see if he can do as well managing the deep fryer. But the automotive parts they need, the aerospace parts they need, the semiconductors they need, the drugs they need, they're not there. And this is going to become quite a problem for the company, which is why we are seeing every industrial sector is grinding down slower and slower. It's either 20% reductions, or some segments up to 60% reductions in appliances and others, where they're disappearing from shelves, they're disappearing from manufacturing. So it's having a pretty profound impact.
But there are still these 240 companies that are performing, as Yale puts it, business as usual in Russia. And isn't that number potentially going to increase, because that initial pressure to pull out has somewhat subsided? And aren't companies going to slowly start to realise they maybe can start to resume or increase their operations in Russia? Are you expecting those numbers to get any higher than they already are?
Rob, I love you and I love our exchanges, but I've had 3,000 discussions and interviews on this topic. You're the first person to suggest that pressure has subsided. That pressure has not subsided. Every single day, we're getting feverish emails from CEOs and generals counsel of firms that are leaving that F list. We graded them A, B, C, D, and F as a schoolhouse. We're good at the grading system, or at least that's what we fall back to. And the companies that are digging in, as we say, are staying there, are diminishing. They're not growing in numbers. The only reason is that some are still there. We keep digging up some, we keep locating some that we hadn't identified before and add them to the list. But there's a one-way migration. nobody has gone back in and opened up and reneged on it. That's a pretty remarkable one-way flow. It is strange that some companies are still there. There are a few chemical companies. It is amazing that Huntsman Chemical is still there, given a former ambassador to Moscow from the U.S., John Huntsman, who also was ambassador to Beijing earlier, who is hostile to both Putin and Xi Jinping. That his brother, a CEO of this family huge chemical company, is still there, but they're sort of an exception. There are some Middle Eastern airlines that are still flying not only to Russia, but unlike the European, U.S. and most global multinational trunk line carriers, are not even flying over Russia because there are overfly fees that are substantial you have to pay if you get there. Is almost every international carrier is flying around Russia to get to Singapore or South Korea or Japan or wherever they're going. And that adds a few hours to the flight, but still that's what they're doing, and passengers are staying with it. But there are Middle Eastern airlines that haven't pulled out. There are also some fashion houses.
Are there any companies that you think will not pull out? Or of those 240 or so, do you think it's possible that every single one of them, could be persuaded to end its operations in Russia?
It's bizarre that they're there. The arguments that they used are some ideological purity, that they don't want to be told what to do. Well, nobody's telling them what to do. All those 1,100 companies that did pull out did so voluntarily. These companies, it has damaged their reputations, it's damaged the career trajectories of any of the executives employed there. It's hurt their enthusiasm of consumers in the marketplace as they've been branded that way. And you could look at sector by sector, country by country, regardless of company size, they're hurt by staying there. They are underperforming. You look at any energy company, even with high energy prices of BP and Shell or Exxon, they're way outperforming Total Energy, which stayed in there. And you think, why aren't they benefiting from these great energy prices? It's because they're seen as a financial and operational and reputational risk. So the markets are downgrading anybody staying there. This is one great example where doing good things and doing well for shareholders are not antithetical. They reinforce each other well.
OK, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, over the last 25 minutes, we've covered an awful lot of ground. We appreciate your time. That's Jeffrey Sonnenfeld from Yale School of Management. Once again, thank you for joining us. And that is all for this business special, looking at the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy. Thanks a lot for watching. If you've enjoyed this, we have lots more videos on the impact of the war on Russia's businesses and beyond that on the DW News YouTube channel and, of course, on Facebook with dw.business. Until next time, take care.